Hello and welcome to the Politics of Time. My name is Andrew Downs. Joining me today is James Toole. We are both members of the Department of Political Science. We are here to talk about time, but before we do that, we want to make sure that we thank our sponsors, the Department of Political Science, as well as the American Democracy Project and the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. We also want to thank the Honors Center for providing us with chairs and tables. We want to thank the library here, the Helmke Library, for letting us use this space for this particular discussion, and of course CATV for recording it, and WBOI for broadcasting it. We should really start this conversation, believe it or not, back in 2005. As I like to say, Jamie's not from around here originally. And one day in 2005, he walked into a classroom, an Intro to American Politics classroom, and what happened when you walked in there, Jamie?
Well, I walked into that classroom intending to teach a normal class on American politics. Can't remember the specific topic. And DST had been in the news, daylight savings time, been in the news, and of course was very controversial in Indiana, as most people listening and watching will know. And not being from around here, I happened to make the comment that I really didn't understand why this was such a big deal. And instantly, about 20 hands shot straight up into the air. And it took me about 20 or 25 minutes to finally wrap up the discussion after I had been well and truly educated on why so many people in Indiana felt very strongly on the issue.
Now, we should probably clarify, you are from?
I am from the East Coast. I'm from Maryland and Connecticut most recently.
Mm-hmm. And there they have been observing daylight saving time for?
Ever since I can remember.
Yes.
And again,
which is a long time, as we should point out. You are a baby boomer.
Yeah, and yeah. Just barely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for context, I should say that when I lived all those years in the East, nobody even talked about DST. It was just not an issue. You set the clocks forward one time of the year, you set the clocks back another time of the year. Not an issue of any controversy.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and start jumping into things, and let's actually talk about time, shall we? Jamie, why don't you start by talking a little bit about an overview of sort of what time it is, so to speak.
Yeah, well, globally, of course, we have 24 time zones, one for each hour of the day, and they are, at least ideally, distributed across the globe in 15 degrees of longitude increments. And now, obviously, not all of these longitudinal lines, and normally these longitudinal lines are not followed exactly. They're adjusted to fit the contours of countries. But basically, there are two key issues, I think, in time and the politics of time zones. The first is where you draw the line and how closely you keep to that 15-degree increment of longitude. The second issue is whether to shift, of course, your time for half the year, as we do currently with daylight saving time. So those are the two key issues, where to draw the line and whether to shift. And those are two separate conversations, but they're often, obviously they have a lot of things linking them together. And I would say, in terms of where to draw the line, as I just suggested, it is the norm to deviate from the line. Obviously, over the open ocean, the line is the division, but once the line hits land, very often the line ends up following, of course, national boundaries, and within larger countries, of course, often follows state, provincial, or other administrative boundaries. When it comes to whether to shift for half the year to daylight saving time, approximately 30% of the countries and territories of the world do shift to DST. Depending on what's going on currently, somewhere around 75 or 78 countries or territories around the world currently use daylight saving time.
Now, we should point out that for those of you who can see on the screen right now is actually a map that shows that if we abided by the 15-degree rule, this is where the time zones would line up. And for those of you who are looking and watching in Indiana, what you will notice very quickly is that Indiana actually should be in the central time. Now I'm going to put up a different map, and this map will show you where the time zones are based on the decisions made by those political jurisdictions. And if you watch very carefully, Indiana jumps over a little bit. Now, fortunately, this particular website was kind enough to draw some areas that are sort of in the wrong place, as some like to call it, and that is this map right here. So this is a map of the world that shows the political jurisdictions that are in the wrong, quote unquote, wrong mathematical time zone. And as you can see, Indiana is one of those places, as is Michigan and Illinois. But this begins to bring up part of the challenge when it comes to deciding what time you're going to be. Indiana truly is right on the edge. If you look at the way we have decided it, the majority of the state is in the eastern zone. But if you look at sort of the rule of 15 degrees, we actually should be in the central zone. And Chicago, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, we have to figure out who we deal with from an economic standpoint. And that then sort of drives some of the disagreement when it comes right down to it.
Yeah. And I think that 15-degree increment goes right through the city of New Haven.
And which is sort of a fascinating thing. We've decided, Jamie and I have decided, that New Haven should not be cut in half. We think that's a bad idea. I'm sure the people in New Haven think that as well.
That's right. We're gonna stand by that.
We are. We're very, very firm in our position on that one. For those of you who are wondering a little bit about the history of daylight saving time, let's go back. For a lot of people, they know that Ben Franklin made reference to this. But it was really in the early 1900s that we began hearing some significant discussion about this, and it came from a couple of sources, but one is a gentleman named William Willett. And William said, and this is a quote from his book, The Waste of Daylight, he said, quote, "The sun shines upon the land for several hours each day while we are asleep, and yet there remains only a brief spell of declining daylight in which to spend the short period of leisure at our disposal." So he was actually making an argument that we should try to line up our activity, our waking hours, to be with the sun so that we actually had time to enjoy daylight. He did make a brief argument about the potential that this might reduce the use of artificial lighting, but that was not really the main point of the argument. Where we start to see, and by the way, he pushed this, he's a Brit, and he pushed Parliament for years to do this, was unsuccessful. Upon his death, Britain still was not observing. He was very disappointed in that. But really, when it comes right down to it, this becomes an argument about energy, even though that's not his original argument. Germany, during World War I, adopted daylight saving time as a way to save energy. And then, believe it or not, in the United States, the first time we adopted it was during World War I as well. And for the most part, this was about saving energy. But another angle comes into play pretty quickly, and that angle is that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, said they love the idea of daylight saving time, in part because of the economic possibilities. And as some folks have said, golf ball sales skyrocketed during daylight saving time. There were other reasons that people thought we should do this, the health argument. But keep in mind that the economic world is not uniform in its love of this. There are folks who have jobs or industries that are based on, actually, believe it or not, sort of darkness. So the movie industry eventually was opposed to this because people don't go to movies when it's daylight outside.
Especially drive-in movies, right?
Especially drive-in movies, exactly. And then and you sort of have to expect this argument at some point. That some people warned that daylight saving time would be, quote, taking us off God's time. Now, what they meant by that is an interesting question, because it's really a question of, are you supposed to be doing things with daylight in the morning or things in the evening with daylight? Apparently, God's time was going to be disrupted by daylight saving time. Someone could be counted on to make that argument. This was repealed at the end of World War I, and so then we can find examples where the government actually engaged in propaganda saying this is a great thing, basically enticing you to become active and involved in the observance of daylight saving time for economic reasons. We got rid of daylight saving time after World War I, and we actually saw it come back during World War II. But outside of that time period, believe it or not, places like New York City chose to observe New York City time. And the reason they did that was because they're a financial industry or headquarters, world headquarters for a lot of folks. They have to interact with a lot of the rest of the world. And a number of places around the world had started to observe it, and they believed it was in their best interest to do that. Now, you'll notice I have up there a poem, and I couldn't find the last years. It was in the 1900s. I want to say in the 1930s, so it just says 19XX. But this is a poem that was sent to Time magazine. Quote, to miss a train or to miss a train or business deal because our clocks are without keel can cause a nation loss of gold, even worse than all the misers hold. In other words, an argument for some sort of part of the time argument. This is, we need some sort of standardization here if we're going to survive from an economic standpoint.
And I would pause here to point out that, really when it comes down to arguments over daylight saving time, there are really two issues. One is whether you like daylight savings time for what it is, and the second is whether concerns standardization. And so whether you like or don't like daylight saving time, you may well argue that whether we have it or not, we all need to be on the same system. Either the whole country is on daylight saving time or the whole country isn't on daylight saving time. And of course, this is one of the big controversies in Indiana when we decided to go on to daylight saving time. Some people saying, well, it shouldn't matter if Indiana is different. We're doing the right thing. We shouldn't be forced to go to daylight saving time. And other people saying, well, whether we like daylight saving time or not, we should all be on the same standard, and it's really confusing for Indiana to be on it for half the year and on the same system as the rest of the country for half the year and off it for the other half of the year.
Now remember, New York actually made an international argument for why we should be observing. Because it's a financial headquarters, it believed that it needed to be able to communicate with the globe, with the rest of the world, which makes a lot of sense. And so this is really, in many respects, an international issue, not just a domestic issue for any individual country. This is about the countries you interact with in many ways. But if you look internal to a country, what you find is an incredible hodgepodge of times. From World War I to World War II, communities decided to establish their own times. Some of which was fine because they were the hub of everything going on, and everyone around them knew what time it was, and in other instances created a bit of a headache. What you see on the screen right now is actually a timetable that was created by somebody using Washington, D.C. as noon. That's the baseline. And then it shows the time it is in a bunch of other cities. I've blown up the portion that has Indianapolis in it, and as you can see, during this particular period, when it was noon in Washington, D.C., it was actually 11:26 a.m. in Indianapolis. That might make sense from a sun perspective, but it becomes kind of difficult to actually schedule your life when you're scheduling meetings and those sorts of things, let alone if you're going to ride a train, for example.
Exactly. Do you want to get into some international things?
Let's go.
So internationally, a lot of the same dynamics are going on. There's some really interesting research about colonial India within the British Empire. And of course, railroads became increasingly important there as well. The railroad, and before that, the telegraph, were catalysts for standardizing time. Because the telegraph was operating in real time, operators in different locations needed to sort of use the same time system, even if the time system they were using was different from what they experienced in their localities, which were still following some local version of solar time. And railroads, of course, needed standardization as well. So in India, for example, and I suspect the same is true here, but I've read about it in India, for a long time, two times were posted at every train station. One was the local time, and the other was the time, was the line time, the time of the rail line itself. One time established for the whole rail line. And in India, which of course was, a massive, it is a massive country and was sort of the largest and most important country in the British Empire, there eventually arose a question of, what time to use. And so the time settled on was known as Madras time, named after the big city that today is known as Chennai. And Madras time was 5.5 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time in Britain, and today all of India is still on that same time. So gradually, over time, and it's the same process in this country, but gradually over time, people start to have to adapt. They have to, for a while, keep both times in their heads: the local time that everybody in their town or village or region is using, plus a time used by the railroads or used by the telegraph or used by some other aspect of the economy or larger life that they're coming into contact with, and eventually it's the standard time that starts to become dominant.
And the efforts at standard time internationally actually go back a good, to the early 1900s, right?
Yeah, they go back quite a ways. In fact, the most important single event was a conference in 1884 held in Washington, D.C., and that was the International Meridian Conference, at which it was decided what the International Prime Meridian would be. And it was decided that the Prime Meridian would be centered on Greenwich, outside of London at the Royal Observatory. The line would go right through the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, and that would serve as 0 degrees longitude for the entire world, and that the 360 degrees of longitude would be arrayed from that starting point. Curiously, not everybody agreed on that. France adamantly insisted that it shouldn't be based in Britain, and apparently held to that insistence until 1911, when finally the French realized that no one was going to use Paris time except for the French as the prime meridian and the time on which international standards were to be based. So it goes back to about that. 1884 is considered sort of the real starting point of sort of global standardization of time.
And when you start thinking about what was happening economically, the late 1800s, certainly early 1900s, there was a growing recognition that we're talking about now a global market, not in the way we think of it today, but certainly different than, say, the middle 1800s even.
Yeah. Very much so. I mean, and of course, this is the peak of the of the European empires, right? The British, the French, the Dutch, others as well around the world. So there are strong economic incentives to have things more standardized. You know, what really increases the need for standardization are real-time interactions over long distances, right? I mean, that's what really, encourages people and countries to get together and figure out these systems. Until you have real-time interactions over long distances, via the telegraph, later via the radio, later via the television, and indeed with railroads, because along a railroad line you need to be able to use the same time system. Until you have that, there's no need. And that also leads us to interesting questions that we might get to later, which is that in a world in which communication is instantaneous through the internet, do we have less reason than ever even to have time zones? And maybe we'll get to that at the end of our discussion.
See, when we start talking about that sort of thing, I want to go there right away, but I'll demonstrate some discipline. I will bring up that actually in Indiana, as an example, since we did not observe daylight saving time for a very long time, in Indiana, there actually were parts of the state that did exactly what you're describing in India. They actually had what they referred to as local time, and then the other time, whatever that may be. Some people actually would occasionally refer to the later time as slow time, as opposed to that sort of had a derogatory term or feeling to it, and it took some people time to get used to that. A couple of other things as far as the history of daylight saving time is concerned. 1966 is when the Uniform Time Act was passed, and this was the moment when Congress said we'll observe 6 months on, 6 months off of daylight saving time. However, each state was allowed to decide whether it was going to participate or not. Arizona had as part of its argument against observing daylight saving time, hey, when it's 100 degrees outside, do you really need to be outside later in the evening? Which is kind of a good argument from Arizona, but not the same argument that other places need to have. Nixon called for year-round daylight saving time, which is something that comes up periodically, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But in '86, the U.S. began observing 7 months of daylight saving time. Golf and barbecue industries claimed that it was worth $200 to $400 million a year to them, because it meant people would go out golfing late, they'd be out late barbecuing, so they'll actually go buy equipment and use it, and this would be wonderful, they said. And then in 2005, we actually bumped it up to 8 months of daylight saving time. So we do keep changing the amount of time, or the distribution between the years, which is an interesting thing we do here. If you look at the basic arguments for why we should observe daylight saving time, they fall basically into 3 categories. One is to have the distribution of sunlight match our waking hours. But keep in mind, what that means is different for different folks. Folks who work in the building trades, for example, especially roofers, they like daylight in the morning because it gets hot by the afternoon. They don't want to be up on a roof. Other people would say, no, we need the daylight in the back end of the day because that's when people can go golfing, etc. The economic benefits are often brought up, whether that's by energy savings or just outright economic benefits that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other chambers of commerce would back. And then, of course, the safety argument, which doesn't that Jamie was unfamiliar with before he came to Indiana. That's true. And what are some of the safety arguments, Jamie?
That's a really good question, Andy. I think I need to let you answer that because I'm.
Oh, Jamie.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, there is one other reason.
No, of course there. I mean, yeah. So, all right, go ahead.
I was going to say there are other reasons to go for daylight saving time, and that is, of course, because everyone else is doing it, and peer pressure being what it is, why not do it? Although more accurately, we can see this actually playing itself out. Antarctica actually observes daylight saving time so that it's on the same time as its suppliers.
Yeah, and there are a lot of studies, and we'll talk about studies in a minute, I think, but there are a lot of studies showing, of course, that economic coordination, that coordination of time and other standards matters a great deal and has a lot of benefits, economic benefits. So the strict standardization argument, I think, ends up being a very powerful one. Now, when you get to specific arguments about DST and whether we should all go on DST or all stay off DST, remaining standardized, but whether it should be DST or not, then we get some other interesting conclusions, some of which go against the original rationales for DST.
Yeah, and occasionally what we'll find are folks actually will publish some data that's interesting. For example, National Geographic, this was from a number of years ago, actually said that during the first week of daylight saving time, television watching goes down 10 to 15%. And if you all think about your own viewing habits from, let's say, 10 years ago, that might have mattered to you quite a bit, and that's part of the reason that we saw shows go on hiatus during the summer. Now we view things differently. I'm not sure we would find this same finding if we had similar research done today. And then even individual businesses will calculate it. Hardee's, for example, calculated that it was actually worth an extra $880 a week for them, in part because people are up later, per store, thank you. They're up later, they're out later, and are willing to eat food a little bit later.
And presumably staying up later means eating more Hardee's.
Of course it does. I can't believe you had to state that for everyone. Now, there are other research findings that people would consider to be a bit more serious than those, not that they aren't serious, but much more global. For example, the safety argument is one that comes up and probably deserves a little more conversation. Keep in mind that safety is about criminal safety, crime, and then it's also about health and welfare. When you talk about the criminal side of things, we actually see, when we flip to daylight saving time, we actually see a reduction in robbery rates. And that reduction is actually throughout the entire day. It's in the morning, it's in the day, it's in the evening as well. This is information that came out just a couple of years ago from Brookings Institution. And according to their data, it actually saves us somewhere in the neighborhood of $59 million a year in social costs because of the reduction in crime, which is really kind of a fascinating thing to see. They also like to point out that, quote, apparently criminals aren't early risers, end quote. So if you shift the time of day, you know, you can have these things happen. But the more serious argument is that if you put daylight at the end of the day, then you and I are more likely to stay active later into the day, which then delays when criminals will be able to do their criminal activity, and therefore we end up in a safer environment, so to speak. Now, the other part of this, and this is data that a number of people have gathered, there is some data that shows that our response time is slower after the shift in both the spring and the fall, that there are more heart attacks that happen in the week afterwards, that our bodies basically just take time to adjust, and there are more workplace injuries as well. Some people find this data to be a little more questionable than others. Jamie?
I haven't taken a close look at the data, Andy. I'll leave that up to you. It is only 1 hour, however, so I'm a little more skeptical than maybe others would be. I mean, you know, you fly from Chicago to New York. Do you get jet lag? I think very few people would say they get jet lag. Now, so I'm a little skeptical. My guess is that there are a lot of other factors that might be involved in this.
And that's part of it. You start thinking about the routines that people run through every day, and we drive to work the same way, we leave at the same time. And for many of us, we're not even thinking when we're doing that any longer. So if you disrupt that a little bit, throw some additional cars in the way, change something about it, there's the potential that that could actually go poorly for us. That might help to explain it. But there is, whether you like it or not, the data that shows that these are issues that, that do come up. We do have the energy argument to have, which is the one that, remember, this all started with. Germany said during World War I, we'll save energy. We did the same thing during World War I, World War II. Well, in 2005, the Department of Energy did a rather extensive study and found a reduction of about 0.5% in energy usage because of the extension of daylight saving time. Now, this would suggest that we should be observing daylight saving time. And keep in mind that Brookings Institution somewhat jokingly and somewhat sincerely said maybe we should be observing daylight saving time all the time. More importantly, after Indiana switched, it provided a great moment for an experiment. And a couple of economists in 2011 were able to crunch a whole lot of data, and what they actually found was that energy consumption in Indiana went up 4% after the switch to daylight saving time, and it makes a lot of sense. While you may not need lights because the light is around for later, quote, in the day, you end up using more air conditioning, you end up using more use other devices that use up electricity. Now, in 1916, 1918, air conditioning wouldn't have been an issue, and so then it might have made sense from an energy consumption standpoint. Today, we don't really see that. In fact, like I said, an increase of 4%. Additionally, as they called it, social cost, increased pollution, et cetera, of $1.7 to $5.5 million per year. So it's not an insignificant amount of cost that we're talking about here, and really does begin to undermine a lot the energy argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's move on to another issue. I think now that we... Oh, do you still have more you want to talk about concerning the history?
I think I'll get to it when you start.
Sounds good. Well, one of the bigger questions concerning this is the role that government and politics play. And we know that, of course, politics plays a role because this deals with people's preferences and people's interests and people's needs, and indeed people's feelings about things. And of course, if you live in a democracy, those things matter a lot, and they should. But there's also the role of government, and so I'd like to briefly talk about that. The standardization, the standardization of time is part of the general standardization that at least well-run states offer. In the United States, we have a bureau called the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And its mission is to develop and promote equitable measurement standards for industry. And of course, this goes well beyond the measurement of time. Standards for wireless technology, biopharmaceuticals, medical imaging, chemical manufacturing, all sorts of things are sort of coordinated and developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. My fellow amateur radio operators will know that it also operates a station called WWV in Fort Collins, Colorado, which broadcasts the correct time of day to an accuracy of 0.001 milliseconds. That's not taking propagation effects into account. And behind us here, we see the clock ticking away, the atomic clock. And WWV in Boulder is the station that sends out that signal to commercially available atomic clocks. You might have one or more in your own home. And usually in the middle of the night, that radio picks up the signal from WWV and coordinates its clock with the National Bureau of Standards. So this is so government then plays an important role in standardizing time, whether you want it to be DST or not DST, right? Internationally, of course, governments don't have quite the authority that governments have over people in sovereign states, and so it's the job of international law and international diplomacy, negotiated and coordinated among different countries to try to reach standards. And it's worth noting that there is no international treaty that forces countries to be on any one system, but it is international diplomacy and law that have created conferences like the International Meridian Conference that help to standardize this across the globe. And maybe in a minute we'll talk about some of the unusual time zones we find in the world where countries, while accepting very clearly the International Meridian Conference standard, have carved out interesting exceptions for themselves.
Yeah, in addition to NIST up on the screen behind us, you also see a map of the world showing who is observing daylight saving time. As Jamie pointed out, it's only about 30% of the countries that do not observe daylight saving time. So a majority are doing it. And if you look at the map, a couple of things should occur to you. For example, these are, for the most part, richer, more developed countries, countries with a lot of interaction with their neighbors. In poorer, less developed countries, not as a uniform rule, but as a general rule, fall into that category. On a more local level, let's talk about Indiana for a moment. Indiana has had some interesting time with daylight saving time, let's call it. We did, back in 1949, actually outlaw daylight saving time. Not just that we wouldn't observe it, but outlawed it, said that it cannot be observed. We did spend some time in the Central Zone, 1957, and then switched to the Eastern Time Zone in 1972. These are all decisions made by the state legislature. The state legislature is a body that is making rules about everything in your life. They're going to make rules about taxation, about public safety, about the environment, and yes, very much so about time as well. We, in 2005, had a General Assembly that approved the observance of daylight saving time. As you all know, Jamie was surprised by the fact that we weren't, and in 2006 we became the 48th state in the Union to observe it. Arizona and Hawaii do not. But in spite of this, and the argument that was made by Mitch Daniels when he pushed for daylight saving time was not about saving money. It was not about some of the arguments we've heard. Instead, it was actually about creating a uniform standard for economic development reasons. It's confusing when you have to say to people, well, this time of the year I'm an hour behind you, or I'm an hour ahead of you. That it does create some problems. I know at one point some friends of ours who were living in Indiana, but in Northwest where they sort of observe daylight saving time, said they were coming to visit Jill and me in Fort Wayne, and they would be here at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock rolled by, they weren't here. 11:15, no. 11:30, no. We were getting nervous. This was pre-cell phone days. And then at about 11:45, it dawned on us, oh, they're going to get here at 11 o'clock Central Time. And sure enough, noon, they knocked on the door, and there they were. These sorts of problems happened quite a bit in the state, and it was happening throughout the entire state, especially for places that didn't interact with, say, Chicago on a consistent basis. So the more sporadic, the more conversation went into figuring out what time it was or what time the meeting was going to take place. But the standardization argument then sort of fell apart because now today we have 80 states in the eastern zone. We have 80 counties in the eastern zone and 12 counties in the central zone. So we're not even standardized today. But this gets back to the question of where is your economic activity. If you are in Northwest Indiana or if you're in Southwest Indiana, you are interacting with Central Time Zone folks. If you're in Southeast or basically anything east of 30, you're dealing primarily with Eastern folks.
And it's worth pointing out that while we're not standardized internally so that all people in Indiana are in the same time zone, we now, as a result of Mitch Daniels' efforts, are standardized nationally so that we switch to DST and off DST with 47 other states.
Right, and that has helped because now it's not a question of, oh, is this when you're with us or not? Now
That's
it's
right.
a question of in which time zone are you? And I think most of us have had a conversation with somebody in another state where we've had to ask, what time zone are you?
Exactly, and there are economic costs to that. Reading a quote from a New York Times article in 2005 on the debate in Indiana, Kevin Brininger, president of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, is quoted saying, up to now it's been death by 1,000 paper cuts. The missed conference calls, the missed plane flights, the missed delivery schedules.
And there's something to be said for that. I think we still probably have several of those going on, but now then it's
For other reasons.
It's a different human error at that point,
Exactly.
I think. Yeah. When we are looking at the role of government, Jamie, you brought up that there are some interesting cases out there.
There are.
Where would you like to begin?
Well, there are basically two ways in which time zones can be unusual. The first is they can have an unusual offset from the 1 hour standard. So, you know, regardless of what time zone you're in, you're usually in a multiple of 1 hour away from other time zones. There's some time zones that don't do that. And the other thing is there are time zones of unusually large size. And so those are the two things. One, the offset, two, the size. So let's look at the offset. There are a number of countries in the world that have a 30-minute offset. So they're half an hour off most of the rest of the world. And just to give you a list of these countries, they include Iran, Afghanistan, India, as I mentioned before, 5.5 hours off Universal Coordinated Time, Myanmar, North Korea, which famously declared its own new time zone recently. We can talk about that too. Part of Australia, and part of Canada, and we might talk about Newfoundland in a few minutes. Some of you may have heard about Venezuela's 30-minute offset. Just last year, Venezuela returned to the 1 hour offset, so it sort of went back to what is globally the norm. And then we have a few that are really odd, and they have 45, or looking at it another way, 15-minute offsets. And the most famous of these, and the only one that is a full sovereign state, is Nepal and the Himalayas, but also the Chatham Islands. An integral part of New Zealand, off the east coast of New Zealand, run at a 45-minute offset. And unofficially, about 200 people in the center of Australia use what is called Central West Australian time. It's unofficial, but it's on a 45-minute offset. And I admit to not being an expert on this, but a few of the articles I read noted that this involved about 200 people, including one roadhouse.
That's a level of specificity.
A few towns and a roadhouse.
Yes, that's a level of specificity.
Yeah.
It's very detail oriented.
Exactly. And so, so those are offsets. Let me talk briefly about zones of unusual size. There are a lot of countries that span 2 zones geographically but choose to remain one time zone, and that makes a lot of sense. Usually these countries just spill over into the second one. A bit stranger are countries that cover what should be 3 time zones but have only 1. Kazakhstan is a good example of this. We also have Alaska and Greenland. Of course, they're not fully sovereign countries. They're parts of other countries. Alaska spans 4 time zones, what would normally be 4 time zones, and Greenland spans what would be 5 time zones and operates only 2 of them. But it's worth noting with Alaska and Greenland, and we should now get into sort of reasons why there are these unusual offsets, or these unusually large zones. Alaska and Greenland, of course, are very far to the north, and when you get close to the poles, of course, lines of longitude come much closer together. So these examples are probably more dramatic than they may seem. But there is one very famous example of an unusually large time zone that was formed for very political reasons, and that is Beijing Standard Time, which covers all of China. China should geographically have up to 5 different time zones, but operates on only 1. There's some really interesting research on this, but it's very clear that the impetus for this was political. One of the very first acts of the new communist government after the revolution in China in 1949 was to create Beijing Standard Time, and it was done for an avowedly political purpose. It is noteworthy that Beijing, the city on which the time zone is based, is very far to one side of China. It's very far to the east, so a central city was not picked. Instead, the capital city was picked, even though its time zone was pretty grossly inappropriate for the far western portions of the country. And today, it remains an issue in China. Of course, it helps, I suppose, to some degree to have standardization throughout the country, but the further west you go, the more distorted the time zone becomes, and the more common it is for people to basically keep 2 time zones in their head: one official Beijing time, and the other a local time that people often use in their ordinary daily activities.
For those of you who've been looking at the screens behind us, you'll see that we've had a few examples up on the screen for a while that base everything off of London at noon. And when you look at that, what you see is that several places are interesting. For example, Fort Wayne, we're 4 hours off, and this is as of October 31st, so October 30th, before the United States shifts. St. John's, Canada, Newfoundland is 3.5 hours. Kathmandu, there's the 45 or 15-minute example that Jamie mentioned a moment ago. New Delhi, a 30-minute example. And then, of course, 2 of my favorite, Beijing and Kashgar, which are just about as far apart as you can get in China, are both at the exact same time right now. And then Adelaide down in Australia is one of the half-hour observers. There's a question here that we'll get to right at the end, I think, and that's a question of, what really is necessary about time. There are people who say, okay, fine, let's just all have 1 international time. You sort of already have suggested that. And so instead of going to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, you might actually go to work at midnight, but it's still 8 o'clock in the morning as what we're used to today. I do want to quickly talk about the example of Newfoundland, and Newfoundland and Labrador was not originally part of Canada. It was off on its own. It eventually was absorbed into the Commonwealth, and when it did, or before it did, it had established what time it was, and it did so based on the sun, based on geography. It decided that the 30-minute break made sense to them, and this was, although at the sort of the beginning of understanding a more global market, it still made some sense for them to have this as their time. If you listen to CBC or watch things on CBC, you will see that Newfoundland still observes 30 minutes off of everything else. They're 30 minutes ahead of everybody. And interestingly, they will occasionally use this to their advantage. They will, for example, refer to the world premiere of television programs because they start half an hour earlier in Newfoundland than they do everywhere else. So they'll do things like that, little tricks. But when they became part of Canada, there was really, sort of a desire to keep some semblance of themselves as an entity, and 30 minutes off was a way to do that. In the 1960s, there was an attempt to actually put them into Atlantic time, and there was basically a revolt among the people. No, we don't want to do that. We lose our sense of self if we do that. If you look at a map, though, what you'll see is the island of Newfoundland, and that's where they really observe the 30 minutes quite carefully. In the southeastern part of Labrador, they observe it, but in the rest of it, they observe Atlantic. They're technically on Newfoundland time, but in their heads, they're keeping track of Atlantic time instead. And then, of course, the map of Australia is a very interesting one. I'm not sure if you want to make any other comments about Australia at this time.
Well, Australia is complicated because I think, maybe 4 states plus the Australian Capital Territory use DST and the others don't. And then you have half-hour offsets. So Australia gives you everything you might want in a time zone controversy. You get some parts of it on DST, some parts of it off, and you get half-hour increments, et cetera. So it's a pretty interesting place. I wanted to, did you have anything? I wanted to say something else about the reasons for these unusual time zones. And Andy and I both, I think, have alluded to these. The reasons boil down to geography and politics. And very often, it's a combination of both. As Andy said with Newfoundland, you know, maybe it's primarily geographic, but it also creates a certain political point, or sort of becomes deeply embedded in local culture, always has, long has been, and becomes a point of local pride. So, you know, when we look at these offsets, I mentioned Kazakhstan earlier in what should be 3 time zones, but if you look at a map of Kazakhstan, most of it's in the middle of those 3 time zones. So geographically, it makes sense. The port parts in the other 2 time zones are smaller parts of the country. Very different from what we said about China, where the whole country is on the time zone of something at of a city on one extreme. When we look at you know, very political reasons, we have the example of China. We also have this great example from North Korea. North Korea created its own new time zone in August of 2015 called Pyongyang time, named after the capital. And there's a great quote here from the North Korean press agency. This is quoted in the Washington Post. And here's the rationale for creating its own time zone. And I quote, "The wicked Japanese imperialists committed such unpardonable crimes as depriving Korea of even its standard time while mercilessly tramping down its land."
That's some reasoning right there.
You know, if you're going to come up with your own time zone, you want to make it a good reason.
I can respect that reason.
There you go.
Being trampled is a big deal.
It is.
Let's talk about proposals for reform, shall we?
Right. So here in Indiana, we have obviously some clear options, or at least some continuing controversies, right?
Yeah, actually, if you look at the General Assembly's website, daylight saving time is still a subject listing in the subject listing of legislation that's available to look at. There was nothing filed last year, just to calm everyone down. No one was trying to do anything. I don't know what will happen this year, but it is an awkward thing. I've talked with elected officials who've actually polled on this, and they pretty much say if you look at Highway 30, which divides the state in half from north to south, people on the eastern side like Eastern time, people on the western side like Central time. And so it's hard for us to find an answer to the question. Yeah. Beginning to observe daylight saving time brought some uniformity, but not fully within the state. I mean, you have to worry about what time it is when you drive from one county to another in some instances, and for some folks that's a bit of an issue. We do know that it's something that people still care about. As recently as I believe it was last year, there was a legislator who said she was going to introduce some legislation about daylight saving time, eliminating it again, and use the argument of safety. It's dangerous for children in the morning when it becomes so dark, when we fall back. That it hasn't actually helped us economically, it didn't save us any energy, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the continuing argument comes up when it comes to Indiana specifically.
Sure. And in other parts of the country, there's some interesting proposals, none of which have seemed to gain a whole lot of traction. But for example, in Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire, there's been discussion of joining Atlantic time. Because geography would seem to suggest that those parts of New England, which are really, you know, a lot farther east than most parts of the East Coast, really geographically make sense in Atlantic time. But that would create a 5th time zone for the mainland U.S. And as I said, this proposal hasn't gotten much traction. But you know, there are always people talking about ideas like this.
Well, let's clarify, because it actually got a lot of traction in Maine. and was working its way through the General Assembly quite nicely until someone attached an amendment, which granted meant, 50% plus one voted for it, but attached an amendment that the other states also had to begin observing it.
Well, right. And again, that's that argument for standardization. So there's a strong realization that going it alone doesn't help, particularly as the world becomes more globalized, the internet, et cetera. There are, however, broader broader proposals for how to change things. Alison Schrager, in an article in the Atlantic Monthly from November 2013, got a lot of discussion by proposing that the country as a whole, and again, this is very much in keeping with standardization, but sounds like a radical proposal, shift to just 2 time zones and scrap DST. So we get rid of daylight savings, so we don't switch, and we just glom together the Eastern and Central time zones, and we glom together the Mountain and Pacific time zones, and it would just, help make things a lot simpler. And taking this logic much, much farther, we have the proposal of 2 Johns Hopkins University professors.
You can't trust those people from
No,
Maryland.
well, of course not. Steve Hanke, an economist with Johns Hopkins, is also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And Dick Henry, who's a professor of physics and astronomy at Hopkins. Let me back up by saying that several years before that, they created what they called the Hanke-Henry perpetual, I think it's the the permanent calendar, proposing that we begin every year on a Monday, right? I think it was a Monday. So every year begins the same. January 1st is a Monday. And so your birthday always falls on the same day of the week, for example. And, Christmas always falls on the same. So, these guys obviously are drawn to the appeal of standardization. Yes. And this is standardization in the extreme. And so then they went farther and said, look, we live, now looking at time zones, we live basically in a world that has been transformed by the internet. And real-time interactions are happening all over the world, all at once. So why do we even need time zones? And so their proposal is on January 1st, 2018, and they're proposing that this not be done necessarily through legislation, but as a citizens movement. So if you want something to believe in, and you've been just dying to get out there and change society, here you go, you can follow them.
Here's
on January 1st, here's your cause. January 1st, 2018, all time zones be abolished. And the whole world used the time centered on London. So, when it's, and so what that would mean, of course, is that everyone not living in the time zone centered on London would have to adjust their thinking. Here in the middle of the United States, we'd probably be getting up at 12 o'clock. 12 noon would be kind of a standard, normal wake-up time. And I see people in the audience thinking that might be nice.
Yeah.
But it also means that
12 noon what we know now.
that you're eating dinner at midnight, or close to it. So obviously that proposal is probably not going to gain a whole lot of traction, but this is standardization taken to the extreme. And their argument is that in terms of economics, this would be very, very efficient. There'd no longer be any misunderstandings. But of course, it'd be a huge cultural shift, right, for people to be thinking about, the hours in very different ways.
I do have to point out, from a standardization standpoint, Ireland, for example, flipped a week before, or fell back a week before the United States.
That's true. And the UK did too.
And the UK did too. So what you end up with is different countries deciding when daylight saving time begins and ends, or deciding at different times when that begins and ends. And this idea that this is about standardization, this is about better economic development, there's a whole lot of mess out there still.
Maybe we can solve all the world's economic problems through this. What do you think?
I'm willing to give it a shot.
We'll work on that and come back with
that's the next talk.
Panel discussion.
I do want to thank Jamie for spending some time talking with me about daylight saving time. I will mention one final thing. The first year we were observing, there was an end-of-year gathering in the department, and unfortunately for Jamie, there were at least 2 people at that party who were very, very excited about the topic of daylight saving time. Not supportive, but excited. And every now and then, I would just ask Jamie a question and make sure that when he answered, those 2 people were nearby, and then a good 10 or 15 minutes would get lost watching them argue, and I would walk away, and then I would come back later on and stir things up again, because Jamie did not quite understand our view as Hoosiers of daylight saving time, or time in general, apparently.
Andy is a provocateur. That's all I'll say.
On that note, I would like to say that the audience has a chance to ask us some questions. So if you have questions, please ask them. I'm just guessing that we have one coming from Georgia.
Yes, I do have a question that relates to what Jamie was talking about with the two professors. Lately, it's the idea of technology, globalization, local politics, and the politics of time. And in some professions, the two I'm thinking of, the medical profession, especially when it comes to radiology, and in the legal profession when it comes to research, what has been seen given the internet and digital research or reading of x-rays and other things is that you're seeing individuals, doctors and lawyers in other parts of the world, India's often talked about, etc., reading radiologists reading x-rays, doing research, etc. And there's actually been, I can speak more about this in terms of the bar, talk about this. This isn't good. It's taking away from the economics of the local bar because the time is so different. And it's the connection between globalization, economics, time, and some talk that maybe we need some sort of legislation to prevent that kind of thing happening, and almost a protectionism. It's kind of the opposite of standardization. And I was just wondering what y'all think about that.
I mean, that is so interesting. So here, I think we're talking about sort of a nationalist backlash against time, and we don't have to think of, in this case, nationalism in such strong terms as it often is. But really, yeah, it's kind of a local backlash against the forces of globalization. And I think when we look around the world right now, politically, I mean, of course, what we are seeing in so many places is a resurgent nationalism, and we're seeing sort of rebellions in many different ways, I think, against more centralized power, against more global standardization, in favor of local autonomy, in favor of the protection of local cultures, et cetera. I mean, we're seeing it all the time now. We're seeing it in election results in Europe. We're seeing it to some degree in election results in the United States. We're seeing Catalonia try to break away from Spain. We're seeing the Kurds have an independence referendum. Those examples don't necessarily pertain to time, but they pertain to the larger phenomenon. And I think we are right now living, and this may be the single largest pattern in global politics today, we right now are living in an age of some degree of backlash against globalization. Look at the immigration crises as well in Europe in 2015. Of course, immigration, a big issue here today in the United States as well. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. It takes us to the very broadest level.
There are economists who actually are looking at this, and for service industry like attorneys or radiologists, what it's actually doing is creating a much longer day in which work can be done, and thereby taking advantage of more of the clock. And so there are a lot of economists who are saying this is a good thing. This is a way to expand the pie, so to speak. Obviously not thinking about it from the perspective of the individual practitioner in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Or, yeah, professionals, because when you think of kind of nationalism and protectionism of late, it's been the kind of white working class person that's been talked about. And interestingly enough, these are two of the kind of professions you've seen as the kind of Cadillac professions in the past. So it's interesting in that respect.
Are there other questions?
I guess my question is, while the pros and cons of daylight savings times, they seem to be continually still debated, and so my question, I guess, is, I guess, never mind, it's just kind of silly, but should legislatures really be spending time on, let's pass a bill, let's go back, let's pass it again, and back and forth when there are other issues that, I mean, maybe wait until the economists get more evidence? And
well, that's an interesting question. I think this is going to be one of those things that there's never a clear answer on, and you will be able to argue it no matter what. We just made the argument that for certain service industry occupations, the current environment's actually a lot of time, not of politics in general, is allowing for more economic growth or prosperity, or activity, I should say. But then there are other industries where it's actually not helping. And so, I can find evidence that says yes and no. When that's the case, when we're dealing with human beings, who have differences of opinion. You know, you may like your daylight in the morning, you may like your daylight in the evening. That's never going to change. There will always be people who have those differences of opinion. And as long as that's taking place, then we will have legislators who will bring these things up. Some of them will be tilting at windmills, and for those of us who watch politics and enjoy the discussions of time, we'll smile and enjoy that moment, and then others will be frustrated and angry about it because they believe the issue's already been dealt with.
Yeah, and I would say, I agree with that, and I would say that you know, this is so interesting because the politics of time and time zones in particular involve not only material interests but also symbolic commitments, using academic language here, right? So yeah, we, you know, to some degree, or a lot of people do care about, you know, what the economic analyses say. But for a lot of people, also what really matters is how they feel. And some of the debate in Indiana really has been about, and I remember this from some of those early arguments that Andy referenced earlier, some of the debate in Indiana really is about sort of Hoosier pride, I think. You know, like, why should Indiana have to switch just because everybody else is doing it a certain way? And there's sort of this deep kind of emotional commitment that is very important in politics. I mean, we should care about rationality and empirical evidence in deciding political issues, but we also should care about how people feel. And so it's, I think, of endless interest to Andy and I that this issue just goes on, and it goes on in part because the empirical analyses don't fall clearly on one side or the other, although I think they really are starting to fall more on one side than the other. But also because there is such sort of passion behind something, time, that doesn't look like something that would evoke passions. And as I said about the studies, I mean, my opinion on this has actually changed a bit. I've always said that I'm agnostic about daylight savings time. I really don't care whether we keep it or get rid of it, but what I really care about is standardization. The idea of Indiana being in one time zone for part of the year, another time zone for another part of the year doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. However, and I grew up with daylight savings time, and I always enjoyed the long summer evenings. So for me, daylight savings time was always great. But looking at the studies, I'm realizing that, you know, maybe if we look at the cold hard economic numbers, it doesn't really pay off. So I'm open to sort of changing my mind about this, but I don't think I have a whole lot of passion invested in it either. So, and I do think we need to take the passion into account.
I think that's probably pretty a good summary right there. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank College Television for capturing this for us, WBOI for broadcasting it. Remember, this is brought to you by the American Democracy Project, the Department of Political Science, as well as the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. My name is Andy Downs. This is Jamie Toole. Thank you very much for joining us.